Occupied France, August 1943. On a remote Luftwaffe airfield, just after 400 hours, Oberleutnant Werner Schulz, Chief Technical Officer of Jagdgeschwader 26, received a piece of news that should have been a triumph. An American P-47 Thunderbolt had been forced down, its pilot captured, and the aircraft itself was largely intact. This was intelligence gold. For months, German pilots had been encountering this massive, bizarre American fighter, reporting capabilities that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Now, German engineers would finally have a chance to examine one up close. When Schulz saw the P-47 sitting on the tarmac, his initial reaction was the same as every German pilot's. It was grotesque, an obscenely fat and ungainly flying milk bottle. But as he began his methodical, scientific examination of the enemy machine, the engineer who believed in numbers was about to uncover a devastating truth. The P-47 wasn't grotesque, it was a prophecy, and its components were a mathematical proof that Germany had already lost a war its leaders didn't even know they were fighting. Schulz was not a combat pilot. He was an aeronautical engineer who had worked for Messerschmitt before the war. His job was to understand enemy aircraft, to dissect them piece by piece, identify their weaknesses, and recommend tactical countermeasures. His world was one of slide rules, stress calculations, and the cold, hard logic of physics. When he arrived at the airfield and saw the P-47 for the first time, his initial reaction was the same as every German pilot's. This thing was grotesque, obscenely fat, and ungainly. The fuselage was massive, a giant barrel built around an enormous radial engine. The aircraft weighed nearly 8 tons fully loaded. For comparison, the Focke-Wulf FW-190, Germany's sleek, powerful frontline fighter, weighed about 4 tons. The German pilots had nicknamed it the Fliegende Flasche, the flying milk bottle. Looking at it sitting on the tarmac, Schulz understood why. It looked like it had no business being in the air. But Schulz was a scientist. He didn't care what it looked like, he cared what it could do. And as he began his meticulous examination, what he found would shake him to his core. Schulz started with the heart of the machine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. When his team removed the cowling, they stood in a stunned silence for a long moment. The engine was enormous, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows of 9, creating a massive radial configuration that explained the P-47's bulky appearance. But size alone wasn't what stunned Schulz. It was the quality, the precision, the sheer engineering sophistication. Every component was machined to tolerances that German factories, under the strain of war, were struggling to maintain. The cylinders were uniform, perfectly balanced. The crankshaft was a masterpiece of metallurgy. Schulz pulled out his notebook and began calculating. Based on the displacement and the design, this engine was producing at least 2,000 horsepower, possibly more with the turbo-supercharger system he could see integrated into the fuselage. For comparison, the superb BMW 801 radial engine that powered the FW-190 produced about 1,700 horsepower at maximum output. And that was pushing German engine technology to its absolute limits. The Americans, it seemed, were mass-producing engines with 20 to 30% more power, and they were doing it with apparent ease. But it got worse, much worse. Schulz examined the engine's construction for signs of shortage accommodations, the kind of compromises that German factories were increasingly forced to make. Lower-grade materials, simplified manufacturing, anything to save precious resources. He found none. This engine was built with high-grade aluminum alloys, precision bearings, and components that showed no evidence whatsoever of material shortages or manufacturing shortcuts. It was built the right way, not the expedient way. One of Schulz's assistants, a mechanic who had worked on German aircraft for years, pointed to the cylinders. Herr Oberleutnant, look at this. Each cylinder is individually removable. If one is damaged, you can replace just that component without disassembling the entire engine. Schulz nodded slowly. It was a brilliant piece of design, focused on maintainability. It meant faster repairs, less downtime, and more aircraft remaining operational at the front. German engines, by contrast, often required extensive disassembly for major repairs. This American design assumed that maintenance would happen frequently and needed to be ruthlessly efficient. But there was something else that caught Schulz's attention, something that made his stomach tighten with a cold dread. The real secret of the P-47's performance wasn't just the engine, it was the turbo-supercharger system. Schulz had read intelligence reports about this, but seeing it in person was different. A complex network of insulated ducting snaked from the engine down through the fuselage to a turbine unit mounted in the rear of the aircraft. The system used the engine's own hot exhaust gases to spin a compressor at over 20,000 RPM, forcing highly pressurized air back into the engine. The engineering was staggering. The exhaust had to be channeled through ducting that could withstand extreme heat. The turbine itself had to be made of exotic high-temperature alloys, spinning at speeds that would tear apart inferior bearings. The entire system had to be precisely calibrated to avoid damaging the engine. German engineers had experimented with turbo-superchargers, but they had never successfully fielded one. The technical challenges were too great, the materials too difficult to source, the manufacturing too complex. But here it was, in a standard American fighter that was being mass-produced. Not a prototype, not an experimental aircraft, but a production model, one of hundreds, soon to be thousands. Schulz did the calculations. With this turbo-supercharger, the P-47's engine could maintain its full 2,000 horsepower at altitudes where German fighters were gasping for air. Above 25,000 feet, the FW-190 and Bf-110 lost significant performance as their mechanical superchargers struggled in the thin air. The P-47 at that altitude would just be hitting its stride, becoming fast, powerful, and completely dominant in the high-altitude realm where German fighters had to operate to intercept the American bomber formations. His assistant asked the obvious question, "Can we replicate this system, Herr Oberleutnant?" Schulz shook his head. "Not with our current manufacturing capacity. This system requires precision machining, high-grade steel alloys, and thousands of man-hours of skilled labor. We are already struggling to produce enough basic aircraft. Adding this level of complexity," he paused, "it's beyond our capabilities." The realization was crushing. The Americans hadn't just built a better fighter. They had built a fighter that represented a level of industrial sophistication that Germany simply could not match. After examining the engine, Schulz turned his attention to the airframe itself. What he found was equally disturbing. The captured P-47 had taken significant battle damage. Cannon shells had torn through sections of the fuselage. Machine gun fire had riddled the wings. And yet, the aircraft had flown back and made a controlled belly landing. Schulz examined the damage patterns. Multiple 20mm cannon hits, the kind that would typically shred a German fighter into pieces. But the P-47 structure had absorbed the hits. The heavy-gauge aluminum skin, the robust internal framing, the redundant control systems all contributed to an incredible, almost unbelievable durability. He pulled out the damage reports from Luftwaffe units. Time and again, pilots had reported pumping cannon fire into P-47s and watching in disbelief as the American fighters simply continued to fly. Now he could see the reason. The P-47 was built like a tank. Where German fighters were optimized for weight savings and agility, the P-47 was designed to absorb punishment and keep flying. The cockpit armor was extensive. Thick steel plates protected the pilot from multiple angles. The windscreen was armored glass, far thicker than anything in German fighters. But most importantly, the massive R-2800 radial engine served as a giant shield at the front. Unlike the vulnerable liquid-cooled inline engines in the B-109, the radial had no fragile coolant system. You could shoot entire cylinders off the engine, and it would keep running. Schulz found documentation showing that P-47s had returned to base with multiple cylinders destroyed, fuel tanks punctured, and huge sections of their control surfaces shot away. German fighters with similar damage would have fallen from the sky. One of his engineers made an observation. "It's over-engineered."
They've added weight for durability that could have been used for performance. Schulz nodded. Yes, but they can afford to. They have engines powerful enough to carry the extra weight. We don't. We have to optimize for weight because we lack the engine power to overcome it. It was a fundamental and fatal difference in design philosophy. Germany built aircraft at the very edge of what was technically possible, squeezing every ounce of performance from limited resources. America built aircraft with massive safety margins, compensating for any inefficiencies with brute, overwhelming force. And brutally, the American approach was working better. Schulz examined the P-47's armament next. 8 Browning M2 .50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. His heart sank as he calculated the implications. Each gun was fed by approximately 400 rounds of ammunition. Total ammunition load, 3,200 rounds. The rate of fire for all 8 guns combined was over 100 rounds per second. The firepower was simply devastating. A 1-second burst would put 100 heavy slugs into a target. A 2-second burst, which was typical for a firing pass, would launch 200 rounds. German fighters typically carried a mix of 2 or 4 machine guns and 1 or 2 cannon. Their total firepower was less, and their ammunition was far more limited. A Bf-109 pilot might have only 60 rounds for his cannon. Once that was expended, he was effectively disarmed and had to return to base. The P-47 pilot could fire almost continuously for 30 seconds. In practice, that meant he could make multiple long firing passes across several engagements before running out of ammunition. But it wasn't just the quantity. Schulz examined the .50 caliber rounds themselves. They were heavy, high-velocity projectiles that could punch through armor and structural components with ease. He had read the combat reports from German pilots describing the effect of P-47 fire as a wall of lead. Now he understood why. With 8 guns converging at a single focal point, anything caught in that cone of fire would simply be shredded. German aircraft, with their lightweight construction and limited armor, would disintegrate under this kind of firepower. A P-47 didn't need to be precise. It just needed to get the target generally in front of it and pull the trigger. Schulz made a grim note in his logbook. Recommendation: avoid head-on engagements with P-47s. Probability of surviving return fire is minimal. As Schulz compiled his technical report, he began to see a pattern, a truth that went far beyond any single component. Every system on the P-47 spoke to an underlying industrial capacity that was simply staggering. The engine required precision machining and high-grade alloys. The turbo-supercharger required advanced metallurgy and manufacturing. The airframe required massive amounts of aluminum. The armament required a functioning, high-volume ammunition production industry. Any one of these components would have strained German industry. The P-47 had all of them integrated into a single aircraft, and it was being mass-produced. Schulz requested the latest production data from intelligence sources. What he learned was soul-crushing. Republic Aviation was building P-47s at a rate that seemed impossible. By late 1943, they were producing over 500 aircraft per month. Plans called for ramping that up to 600, 700, even 800 per month by 1944. For comparison, German factories were struggling to produce 300 to 400 single-engine fighters, total, across all types. And German production was constantly being disrupted by Allied bombing. But the numbers got worse. The R-2800 engine wasn't just used in the P-47. It powered multiple other American aircraft. Total production of R-2800 engines would exceed 125,000 units during the war. Over 125,000 of these 2,000 horsepower engines. Germany's entire production of aircraft engines for all types across the entire war would be roughly 250,000 units, most of them significantly less powerful. The Americans were building more of a single advanced engine type than Germany could produce of all its engines combined. The disparity was incomprehensible. Schulz sat at his desk, staring at the numbers. He ran the calculations again, thinking he must have made an error. But the numbers didn't change. American aircraft production for 1943 was projected to exceed 85,000 aircraft. German production would be about 25,000, a ratio of more than 3 to 1. But it was worse than that, because American aircraft were, on average, heavier and more complex. A single B-17 bomber required more aluminum in man-hours than 3 Bf-109 fighters, and the Americans were building thousands of B-17s. The material disparity was overwhelming. America was fighting a global war, supplying the Soviets with thousands of aircraft and tanks, equipping British forces, and still outproducing Germany in every single category. Schulz's final report was due to be presented to the High Command in Berlin. As he compiled his findings, he knew he was writing something dangerous. The report documented the P-47's technical superiority in multiple areas. It acknowledged that Germany lacked the industrial capacity to produce equivalent systems, and it contained a conclusion that would be seen as defeatist. His summary read, "The P-47 Thunderbolt represents a level of industrial and technological sophistication that exceeds Germany's current capabilities. Its widespread deployment suggests American production capacity far exceeds previous intelligence estimates. Tactical adjustments are recommended. Strategic assessment. Continued attrition against a numerically and technically superior enemy will result in unsustainable losses. In other words, we can't beat this, and if we keep fighting the same way, we will be destroyed."
Schulz's commanding officer read the report and looked at him with a mixture of respect and concern. "You know this will not be well received in Berlin. They don't want to hear that American aircraft are superior." "Should I alter the findings?" Schulz asked, already knowing the answer. "No, the report is accurate, but prepare yourself. The leadership doesn't respond well to uncomfortable truths." The report was forwarded up the chain of command. Schulz never received an official response, but he heard through informal channels that it had been dismissed as overly pessimistic. One staff officer reportedly said, "This engineer has been demoralized by enemy propaganda. The P-47 is crude American engineering, inferior to our designs." Schulz wasn't surprised. He had seen this pattern before. Intelligence that contradicted Nazi ideology was rejected, regardless of its accuracy. But for Schulz personally, the examination of the P-47 had been a revelation, not just about an aircraft, but about the war itself. In the months following his report, Schulz watched his predictions come true. P-47s appeared in increasing numbers over Europe. German fighter losses mounted. Experienced pilots were shot down and not replaced. The tactical recommendations he had made were slowly adopted, but by then it was too late. The Americans had achieved air superiority through sheer, brutal weight of numbers and a decisive technical advantage at high altitude. Schulz examined other captured American aircraft. Each one told the same grim story: superior materials, sophisticated systems, and evidence of an industrial base operating at a scale Germany couldn't begin to match. He saw a captured C-47 transport plane, one of over 10,000 that would be produced. He examined a P-51 Mustang, which combined the range of the P-47 with even better performance. Every aircraft he examined reinforced the same soul-crushing conclusion: Germany was losing an industrial war to an enemy with overwhelming material superiority. What haunted Schulz was that this information was available. The intelligence existed. German agents were reporting on American production. The captured equipment proved the quality. But the leadership refused to accept it. Or, more accurately, they accepted it, but believed that German will and superior tactics could overcome any material disadvantage. Schulz had been trained as an engineer. He believed in numbers, in mathematics, in physical reality. And the physical reality was undeniable. Germany was being buried under an avalanche of American steel. After the war, when the full production figures were declassified, Schulz's estimates were proven to have been conservative. He had actually underestimated American capacity. Total American aircraft production from 1940 to 1945 was over 300,000 aircraft.
German production in the same period was approximately 94,000. The United States produced over 15,600 P-47 Thunderbolts alone, more than Germany produced of its Bf-109s and Fw-190s combined during the same period. The R-2800 engine that Schulz had examined with such awe was built not just by Pratt & Whitney, but by Ford and Chevrolet, automotive companies that had been seamlessly converted to war production. Schulz survived the war and was interrogated by American technical intelligence officers. They were particularly interested in his 1943 report on the P-47. "Did you really conclude from examining one aircraft that Germany would lose the war?" an American officer asked. Schulz thought for a moment before answering. "I concluded that Germany could not win an industrial war against America. The P-47 was the evidence. Every component required resources and manufacturing capability that exceeded Germany's total capacity." "But you were just one engineer. Surely others reached the same conclusion." "Many did," Schulz replied. "But in the Third Reich, stating inconvenient truths was dangerous. Better to remain silent than to be accused of defeatism." The American officer nodded. "We found your report in captured German files. It was marked filed, no action required. Did that surprise you?" Schulz laughed bitterly. "No, I expected it. The Nazi leadership didn't want intelligence. They wanted validation of what they already believed. When reality contradicted their ideology, reality was dismissed." The story of Werner Schulz and the captured P-47 is a microcosm of Germany's strategic failure. A trained engineer examined enemy equipment, reached an accurate conclusion, and was ignored. His experience paralleled that of dozens of other competent men who saw the truth and were trapped in a system where truth was subordinate to ideology. The Nazi regime was based on the premise that German racial and cultural superiority would overcome any material disadvantage, that willpower could defeat mathematics. They were wrong. And men like Schulz knew they were wrong from the moment they examined the evidence. His report on the P-47 should have been a wake-up call. Instead, it was filed away and forgotten. The P-47 went on to achieve the air superiority that made Germany's defeat inevitable. And it all started with one engineer examining one captured aircraft and realizing that his nation had already lost a war they didn't know they were fighting. Not a war of soldiers or tactics, but a war of factories and resources. A war where the side with more oil, more aluminum, more steel, and more industrial capacity would inevitably win. America had all of those things in abundance. Germany had none of them.